Hello, and welcome to Lawless Conversations with Katie. I'm Katie, your host. This podcast goes through various difficult subjects such as abortion, gun control, prison systems, or gender, to name a few, and dives into all different aspects of the arguments that might be offered or discussed. At the moment, we are wading our way through the subject of abortion, and today we are looking at the third section of the conception argument, which is personhood. Although I have spent a lot of time and effort into researching these topics, I am by no means an expert on this subject or any other subject I will explore in the future. So take my thoughts with a grain of salt, and of course, if you have any questions or things to add, please share them. I try my best to keep my own biases out of these explorations, and because I'm talking about many aspects of a subject, including opposing ideas and arguments, know that these are not necessarily ideas that I subscribe to or hold personally. I will, however, explore different arguments as if I do believe in them in order to truly explore all facets of this subject. Finally, because these are difficult subjects, there will be some content that is hard to hear and might be triggering. Please understand I am not looking to insult anyone, but to explore these subjects openly and honestly. I don't want to convince anyone to think like me. I want to convince people to think, period. So without further ado, come have a lawless conversation with me. So you can't talk about personhood, obviously, and you can't even talk about the conception argument unless you talk about the concept of the soul. Having a soul is a tricky and frustratingly rational way of looking at conception. And I mean frustrating for those who want to say there is a later point at which an embryo turns into a human or a viable baby. Though those two things, I think, are quite different. Scientifically, there is no marker for life that will not or does not fluctuate and change throughout development, according to one study. And this makes sense. Whatever developmental stage, whatever organ growth, whatever function one is looking at as the marker is actually a step in the process that cannot be separated from the other steps, or the whole process doesn't make sense. For example, saying a heartbeat is what distinguishes life from not life, but you can then say, is it the beginning of the heart being developed at 6 weeks? Or is it when the heart is completely functional at about 10 weeks? Where exactly is the line in that? In an article related to when a soul comes about in a baby, it also makes a fair point. I have to quote it verbatim because it sounds so comical, but I couldn't think of any better way to say it. He says, quote, "Each human being is a certain type of being, and that includes a physical and non-physical element. When that new being comes into being, it will be what it is in its entirety, even though aspects of its being develop later." End quote. Definitely a lot of being in that phrase, but it shares the point perfectly. The formation of the soul at the moment of fertilization makes sense in that where else in the developmental stage would a soul be formed or be present if not at the exact moment of the new set of DNA? One may say that because bodily functions are not present, then the soul does not exist. But then they would have to specify which bodily function constitutes the existence of the soul. The heart, the lungs, the nervous system, the motor skills. But placing the existence of soul on such measures is far too subjective and does not make sense. As the paper mentioned earlier states, if those functions were to go away after being born, either through accident or sickness, we would still consider that person to be alive, with a soul and worthy of protection and rights. Thus, this argument breaks down. The only analogy that could possibly refute this way of thinking would be ice, steam, and water. They are all made of the same substance, H2O. However, they are all three very different things and have very different qualities. You would not call steam ice, or ice simply water, without qualifying what state it is in. In this way, one could say that the developmental stages are very different qualities of existence, even if the soul is present. Thus, one cannot necessarily say that an embryo can be considered and held to the moral standards of an extrauterine being or later developed being. This comes back to the concept I mentioned earlier of the soul makes sense to have been established when you get your DNA, but you would not necessarily be considered a functional or viable baby. And This is the difficult distinction of it makes perfect sense that you would have a soul at that point, but you would not be considered viable and could not survive even with extra measures outside of the womb. However, the ice analogy is probably a shaky retort and could likely be easily broken down by those who understand the development of the fetus better than I do. Moving on. In the conception scenario, some would choose to ignore or at least not consider the other implications of conception equaling a living being. If a fertilized egg can be considered a person, then the questions of life insurance, child support, activities that would require two people, such as driving in the high-capacity lane, or even diet come into play. In circumstances like a pregnant woman driving in a high-capacity lane, how will this be verified? Will women who are pregnant need to carry a pregnancy test with them to prove that they are? Will they be given a ticket that can only be reversed if they appear at court and take a pregnancy test on the spot? Who then provides the test? Is the woman responsible for buying her own test, or will the government provide it? Although this seems like a funny situation to even consider, it is a great example of the many questions that would have to be answered to build laws on the conception belief, or the conception argument. These minute details are often overlooked by those who hold to this belief, but there would have to be strenuous examination and discussion to make sure that the fertilized egg is considered a person in every sense of the word, not just in relation to abortion. Life insurance is another element of the conception argument that is interesting. As there are many miscarriages every year, women would be able to take out a life insurance policy on their embryo or fetus. This aspect is fascinating because personhood in this scenario would not go in the favor of the insurance companies. In a study done in 2021, there were almost as many fetal losses as abortions. That would be 1.1 and 1.3 million respectively. If this were allowed, it would be intriguing to see what the reactions would be and if the idea of personhood at conception would be fought against, or how personhood of an embryo would change the framework of insurance companies. Many people choose to have an abortion because of their life circumstances, such as being poor, homeless, a drug addict, or living in an abusive home, etc. These situations could lead to malnutrition, drug dependency, and physical or mental defects in the fetus. What laws would have to be set in place to protect the life further than simply not killing it? Will there be programs to properly feed, house, and rehabilitate pregnant women? Will these laws lead to women being forced into programs in order to make sure the baby is protected? And if so, at what point does the infringement on the life and freedom of the host or mother outweigh the life and freedom of the embryo or fetus? This is a slippery slope that some extreme individuals on the conception argument fall down. The life in a woman must be protected at all costs. Once one makes the choice to have sex, there is no other choice to be made. If one gets pregnant, there are no rights that supersede the rights of the embryo to live and be born. Thus, those who would die because of their pregnancy are to sacrifice themselves for the baby no matter what. That would be the concept of people who hold conception to an extreme. Conception is a very tricky option for fixing the abortion issue. Just the few aspects explored here dip the proverbial toe into the water and does not dive into all of the questions that would need to be answered for this option to be set in law. Looking at personhood in this way forces one to step into some absurd beliefs and some realistic ideas that should likely be explored. But this too is not a worthy fix to the abortion issue alone. In the sense of personhood, where should the line of personhood be drawn? For example, do you agree that all of these aspects of personhood should be regarded if the conception argument were made law? Should every aspect of personhood be regarded as true? Kind of the same idea, but a little bit different. If you are interested in commenting about this episode or answering any of the questions I just asked, you are welcome to. You can either send me an email at lawlessconversations@yahoo.com. That is LAWLESSCONVERSATIONS@yahoo.com. You can also comment on Twitter at lawlessconvos, LAWLESSCONVOS. Finally, you can also contact me on Facebook if you just look for Lawless Conversations, 2 different words, LAWLESSCONVERSATIONS. I look forward to hearing from you. The references to any sources that I use in each episode will be available in the bio, along with all of these social media connections. Join me on Sunday as I expound a little bit on the soul. Thank you for joining me for this episode. I look forward to Sunday.